Hello there. In today's video I'm going to summarise pretty much everything we've learned about exposure over the previous videos, as well as giving you a little insight into some of the thought processes that you're going to start working on as you get more and more experienced learning and using exposure as you take photographs. This video is part of my Technical Fundamentals course, which is building week by week into a complete beginner's guide to all the technical aspects of photography. Subscribe obviously if you want to get notifications when a new video comes out, like it if you like it, and of course stick some comments below and I'll do my very best to answer them. There's also a full transcript of this video on my blog at photosmudger.com. So, how do we summarise exposure? Well, despite all the things we've talked about, all the myriad things about metering, modes, compensation, all that kind of thing, exposure comes down to those three things: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO or sensitivity. We know those three things are linked. We know that if you take one away, you'll have to add another, or you have to push and pull in different areas. And we know that each of those things has a creative effect on the image. Anything beyond that is essentially just muddying the waters and overcomplicating things. We ought to be perfectly happy working in full manual mode and simply varying those to get the exact shot we want. You should also by now be getting used to the concept that the idea of a perfect exposure or even a correct exposure is slightly misleading. Yes, obviously, we want the viewer to see what we saw in the scene and we need to expose correctly for that. But that doesn't mean that every exposure always has to be average and neutral and grey. Some subjects definitely suit being shot in a dark, moody, almost underexposed kind of way, and the opposite is also true. Sometimes subjects definitely suit being shot in a light and airy kind of way. And in the same respect, the creative effects are not locked in place. You know, who says you always have to freeze motion for a sports image? Or that a landscape must always have every single part of it sharp from front to back with a huge depth of field? All the supposed rules in photography aren't really rules. The only one you really can't get away from is the one that I've mentioned earlier regarding pushing and pulling with an exposure. So if you want to increase your shutter speed by 1 stop, and you want to go 1 stop faster on the shutter speed, if you want to retain the same exposure, you're going to have to either open the aperture up a stop or make the camera 1 stop more sensitive on the ISO, or a combination of those two. That you can't escape. All the other rules are yours to break, frankly. They're really just conventions. So how do you know when you've got the best exposure for the shot? Well, when you balance up the various creative aspects of exposure and what you're trying to achieve in the shot, with the amount of light you've got to play with and the equipment you've got, you'll be left with certain choices you'll have to make. And it's those choices where the creativity lies. Now let me illustrate this by talking through two quite distinctly different looking images. Now both of these are actually relatively complex to put together, but all they come down to is a combination of aperture, shutter speed and ISO, the same as any other shot. Now this first image really does look deceptively simple, a nice, light, airy lifestyle image. For the record, the exposure was f2.5, 1/80th of a second shutter speed at ISO 200. Now my brief here was that I wanted a very light and airy feel and a relaxed, lifestyle, natural sort of vibe. In exposure terms, there's a fair bit of light around, as there's a great big window behind the model and it's a fairly bright day outside, and then there are white walls on the other two sides as well as the wall behind her, which help bounce light back in. Now creatively, I want a shallow depth of field so that just the model is in focus. I don't want distracting details in the background. So I open the lens to nearly its widest aperture and shoot at f2.5. I don't want to go much wider than that because the quality of the lens does start to tail off the wider you go. Now, this only gives me 1/40th of a second shutter speed, even though there's a fair bit of light around. And since I'm on a 50mm lens, remember the rule, 1 over the focal length for the minimum safe shutter speed to avoid camera shake, I increase the ISO to 200, and that allows me to take my shutter speed up to 1/80th of a second. Now all in all, it's a very simple looking image, but still with quite an involved thought process to arrive at this result. Now this second image straight away looks more complex. They've got quite a few more things going on, but ultimately it still just comes down to a choice of aperture, shutter speed and ISO that suit the image. The exposure here was f5.6, 1.5 second shutter speed at ISO 100. Now the brief was that I needed to show off this new glow-in-the-dark running gear. Obviously, therefore, we can't shoot in a bright situation because, of course, the stuff won't glow, it won't show up against the surroundings. I also still need to see the runner, not just the gear, otherwise it would look weird, like some floating clothing. So, I need to create a totally blacked out and dark studio. And I need a fairly long exposure to allow the amount of light coming off the glow-in-the-dark stuff to appear. That gives me the 1.5 second shutter speed. There's also a flash that's been added to pick out the reflective parts of the gear and also to add some light to the runner's body so that, again, we don't get that floating clothing effect. The short duration of this flash actually also helps to freeze the motion, because of course that's why at 1.5 second shutter speed the runner's actually frozen rather than blurred. You can imagine at 1.5 second shutter speed normally the runner would just be a mess, you wouldn't see a thing. But of course the short duration of the flash means that the runner's only visible for that very brief instant the flash is open, so it freezes her motion. So in both these cases, the really complicated looking glow-in-the-dark shoot involving a studio, flash and all sorts of technical bits and pieces, and a more relaxed, very natural looking but still fairly complex lifestyle image, I'm still just dealing with three things: aperture, shutter speed and ISO. Things do get more and more complex the more and more advanced and experienced you get in photography, but you will never be able to escape those three basic facets. It's why I've spent so much time on this course talking about exposure. As long as you've got a good understanding of them, and hopefully more than a good understanding, they should almost become like breathing. It should be absolutely innate, your understanding of what changing certain facets will do to the image. You'll go far, because you'll never escape that fact that you'll only have a certain amount of light, you'll only have certain equipment, and you're always going to be slightly limited in terms of the choices you can make. The other thing to remember, of course, is that on all three scales, the aperture scale, shutter speed scale and ISO scale, they are finite. Yes, you've got lots of choices, but you won't have an infinite number of apertures to choose or an infinite number of shutter speeds to choose. So your choices are always going to be slightly limited. You may be in lucky situations where you're not painted into a corner and forced to make difficult choices, but a lot of the time you will find that your range of options isn't that good and you're going to have to compromise in one area or another. I think compromise is probably a key concept to get across here actually. I'm a professional, I've been doing this more than 20 years, and I've got lots and lots of expensive equipment, and I'm paid to go to exciting places and photograph professional people in their various guises, but it's no different for me. I still have to make compromises. Just to give you one very simple example, I've often used the hypothetical scenario of shooting in a dark sports hall and having to shoot sports imagery. Now in this instance, I'm probably trying to freeze motion, but it's quite a dark environment. So obviously I'm going to try and get a fast shutter speed of at least 1/250th of a second, possibly even faster than that. That means I'm almost certainly going to have to open my aperture wider, possibly as wide as the lens will go. And if I still want to get those two right, I'm almost certainly also going to have to push the ISO up quite far, and that is going to impair my image quality. As we know, the image will get noisy. That is just something I have to live with. Okay, and I have to live with it as a professional. There's no escaping it. Buying better and more kit doesn't allow me to escape those scenarios. Life is all about compromises, and so is photography. Okay, but as long as you understand what effect those various facets of exposure have, you can at least make an informed compromise. Right, that is everything I want to cover about exposure. As I've said, I've stressed it so much because it really is the absolute bread and butter of photography. You can't really do anything else in photography without a good understanding of exposure. What's coming up next over the following weeks and months is all the other bits and pieces that I deem essential to the absolute basics. So different types of cameras, resolutions, memory card, focusing, all that sort of thing, even little bits about stuff like flash. So stay in touch, keep coming back every week, keep your camera in manual mode so you're learning, get out there and practice, and have lots of fun. See you soon.